In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the roles and interactions of species in a community. So we're looking at how they interact with each other, and then also how they respond to changes in their environmental conditions. So let's talk first about some characteristics of communities. One of the first things that ecologists will look at is species diversity, which is kind of how many different species there are, but also how many of each species there are. So it's a combination of species richness, which is the number of different species, and then also species evenness, which is how many of each species you have. So in this picture here, we have community 1 and community 2, both of which have 4 species, A, B, C, and D. But in community 1, you have equal amounts of each species, and in community 2, you have the greatest amount of species A, and then just a little bit of B, C, and D. So we would say that they have the same species richness, but community 1 has a higher species evenness than community 2. Other things we might look at would be niche structure, which is how many potential ecological niches there are and how those differ from each other. We look at geographical location, because what we see is that species diversity declines as we move from the equator to the poles. And that should make sense if you think about the high biodiversity in a tropical rainforest compared to the tundra or the Arctic. It's a significant difference. It's much higher species diversity in the tropical areas than in the polar areas. There are several types of species in communities that we talk about just based on their role or importance in a community. So you have native species or endemic species. These are the ones that are normally found in a particular ecosystem or community. Then the non-native species or invasive, exotic, or alien species, these are ones that are deliberately or accidentally introduced into a community. They're not normally found there, and they can have often a very significant negative impact on the community, and we'll talk more about those guys later. Indicator species are those that serve as early warnings to environmental damage. They tend to have a very low tolerance range, and so any change, any shift from that range shows up very quickly. So trout, certain birds, butterflies often serve as these indicator species. Foundation species are ones that create and enhance habitats that can benefit other species. Kind of the classic example of a foundation species would be a beaver, because they build dams and that can create little pools, which can support all sorts of other organisms. And then lastly, what we have here on the screen is keystone species. Keystone species play critical roles in sustaining the community, and we find that their removal can have a tremendous impact on a community. So the term keystone comes from arches, which have these stones in the top middle called the keystone. And if you remove the keystone, the arch collapses. So same thing with these keystone species. When you remove them from the community, the whole community or ecosystem can collapse. So in this example here, the sea otter is a keystone species, and we can see that when we look at the effect of their loss on sea urchins and kelp. So otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. When the otter population declined, look what happened to the sea urchins, and in turn, what happened to the kelp. So without the sea otters, the sea urchin population exploded, and that caused a significant loss of kelp, and kelp forests are essential habitats for lots of organisms, and so this just completely threw the ecosystem out of balance. And so sea otters were reintroduced by humans to try and help stabilize that community. Competition is a very important aspect of relationships between organisms and communities. And they can compete for all sorts of things, for shared or limited resources such as space and food. And there's two types of competition, either interspecific competition between members of different species or intraspecific competition, which is between members of the same species. What's critical to understand is that no two species can share the same vital and limited resource for very long. Somebody's going to be better at using that resource, and the other species will either be eliminated from that community or have to move somewhere else or have to assume a different niche. So resource partitioning allows species to use the same resources in different ways at different times or in different places. So that's what we're seeing here on the screen. If you take two species and their natural niche, you see there's this region of overlap. Well, that doesn't work. You can't have that sustainably. They're not going to survive that way. So instead, they develop a way of sharing the resources so that they're not overlapping. And it may be something as simple as what we see here with these different birds that all feed in this particular tree, but notice that they feed in different parts of the tree. And by doing that, that's called resource partitioning. They don't actually overlap, and they're both able to, or in this case, all five, are able to coexist. Predation is one that I think we're all pretty familiar with. It's where members of one species, the predator, feed on the other species, the prey. And this predator-prey relationship results in them affecting each other's population size, which we'll talk about more later when we get to populations. But they both have adaptations that allow them to either better pursue their prey, or if you're the prey, avoid being captured. So predators catch their prey using pursuit, ambush, camouflage, and of course their senses. And then prey use their senses, protective shells, camouflage, and chemical warfare to avoid predators. So you can see on the screen here, things can imitate other things to try to confuse the predator. The span worm kind of looks like a stick. You've got the wandering leaf insect that looks like a leaf. Bombardier beetles and foul-tasting monarch butterflies taste bad. Poison dart frogs, of course, are poisonous, so that's not so good. Viceroy butterflies, which are right here, look a lot like those monarch butterflies up above, but they aren't actually foul-tasting, so they're mimicking the foul-tasting monarch butterflies so that other things won't eat it. And then you can have these deceptive looks and deceptive behavior that we see down here. The hind wings of this moth look a lot like eyes of a larger animal, and so it's deceptive. Predators might think it's an animal and not a moth. And then the snake caterpillar, when it's touched, can kind of puff out its shape so that it looks like the head of a snake. So very deceptive and to try and avoid being eaten. So symbiosis is an interesting concept. It's a relationship between two organisms that are living together. The term symbiosis is often used interchangeably with mutualism, but symbiosis truly just refers to a relationship between two species that are living together. So not predator-prey, that's not symbiosis. These guys are living together. Whereas mutualism very specifically is a relationship where they are both benefiting. So symbiosis is a bigger umbrella that includes parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And so mutualism is a specific type of symbiosis, but just be aware that those terms are often used interchangeably. So let's look at parasitism. That's one we're all pretty familiar with. It's where one organism benefits and the other is harmed. So, you know, a flea on a dog or a tick on a dog. So the dog is harmed by the flea or the tick. Mutualism, as we were just saying, both organisms benefit. So the oxpeckers and the black rhino. The oxpeckers feed on parasitic ticks that infest the rhino, and so the rhino benefits because the ticks are eaten off of it, and the oxpeckers benefit because they get food. Clownfish and sea anemones, this one is a often misconstrued relationship. It is mutual. Clownfish benefit by getting protection and food by living in those deadly stinging sea anemones, but they then provide protection for the anemones from other predators. So it's a beneficial relationship to both. Mycorrhizal fungi, these are a type of fungi that grow on the roots of plants, and you can see the difference between having the mycorrhizal fungi and not having it. So both benefit. The fungi get moisture and food, and the plant roots also get some moisture and food. So it's a mutual relationship. And then commensalism, this is a weird one. This is where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. This is one that scientists don't often agree actually exists. Some say that the benefit may be minor or the harm may be minor, but it's there. There's no such thing as not being affected. But the classic example is an orchid in the rainforest. So rainforests are dominated by large trees that block a lot of the sunlight from the forest floor. So these orchids will actually grow on the trunks of the trees so that they can get to the sunlight. They don't actually have their roots in the tree. Their roots are down on the forest floor, but they are kind of viney plants, and so they will grow up the side of the tree so that they can poke out the top of the canopy and get some sunlight. So they benefit by getting sunlight, but the tree isn't harmed in any way by this orchid because it's not taking any nutrients from the tree. Some scientists would argue that it's stealing sunlight from the tree, but I think that's nitpicky. Since the tree is significantly bigger, it's going to get the sunlight that it needs. All right, our last topic is ecological succession. This is the gradual change in species composition of a given area. Now, ecological succession is going on all the time, but we do look at two particular types of succession which happen following specific circumstances. So primary succession begins where no life existed previously. So bare rock that's been exposed by a glacier receding, cooled lava that hardens and becomes rock, abandoned parking lots or highways, a newly created pond. The key to these for the terrestrial ecosystems is there's no soil. And in the aquatic ecosystems, there's no bottom sediment. So basically with this primary succession, it's starting from scratch. So the first species to come in are called the pioneer species. And then they're going to be followed by others. So with primary succession, the first thing you're going to get are lichens and mosses. Lichens are actually a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and an algae. So it's not actually a plant, but so it doesn't have roots. And mosses are non-vascular plants, so they don't have roots either. So they both can grow on the rock. And as they grow on the rock, they actually start to break it down and add nutrients to it. And so as they do that, they're actually creating soil. So then the first plants to come in are usually small herbs and grasses, and then you'll get some shrubs, and then some smaller trees, particularly like pine trees. Conifers tend to be those first early trees that come in, and then later, depending on the particular biome that you're in, if it's like here in Georgia, when you get those deciduous trees, that's when you've reached what they call the climax community, and that's the final stable community. It's still changing, but the dominant plant life is now present. Secondary succession occurs where life previously existed, but something happened that disturbed removed the plant life or destroyed the plant life in that ecosystem. So it can be a hurricane, a tornado, a volcanic eruption that doesn't include lava flow, clear cutting, an abandoned farm, anything where the predominant plant life has been removed, but the soil is still intact. So because the soil is still intact, you don't have that process of breaking down the rock to make soil. So this occurs much more quickly than primary succession, but the general path is going to be the same. Grasses, then shrubs, then the conifers, and then, again, depending on the ecosystem, your deciduous trees. And with both primary and secondary succession, obviously the moving in of the animals is dependent on which plants are present. So we see that change with the animals as well, but we tend to talk about it in terms of the plants.